We learned that tangent of theta is an identity where tangent theta equals sine theta over cosine theta. So we have this from the unit circle where theta is the angle between the positive x-axis and the terminal side where the radius is drawn in. So we know since the radius is 1, which is the hypotenuse, that we can name this leg of the right triangle cosine and this leg of the triangle sine. And tangent is opposite over adjacent, so we have sine over cosine. There are 3 more identities to learn about. These are the 3 identities. We have cosecant, which is abbreviated this way, secant, and then cotangent. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So that's 1 divided by sine theta. And since sine is opposite over hypotenuse, then cosecant is hypotenuse over opposite. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So that means that since cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, secant is hypotenuse over adjacent. And finally, cotangent can be abbreviated this way. It is the reciprocal of tangent, and tangent is opposite over adjacent, so cotangent is adjacent over opposite. So that is how you can create the ratios for each of these trig functions, or you can use the identities to help you. Starting with angle pi over 4, do you remember the sine of pi over 4? The sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So cosecant of pi over 4 is going to be the reciprocal, 1 over root 2 over 2, which means you can flip it over. So 2 over root 2. We're going to rationalize this answer. So we're going to multiply top and bottom by root 2, and we will get 2 root 2 on top when we multiply across, and root 2 times root 2 is 2 on the bottom. This simplifies to root 2. The cosecant of pi over 4 is root 2. Cosine of pi over 4 is also root 2 over 2. So that means the secant of pi over 4 is the reciprocal of that, which is root 2. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1. The cotangent of pi over 4 would be the reciprocal of that, 1 over 1, which is just 1. For angle pi over 6, the sine of pi over 6, that's 1/2. So the cosecant of pi over 6 is going to be the reciprocal of that, 1 over 1/2, which is 2. The cosine of pi over 6 is root 3 over 2. So the secant of pi over 6 is the reciprocal of that, 1 over root 3 over 2. Or you can just write it 2 over root 3. Now that we'll have to rationalize. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by root 3. When you multiply across, you get 2 root 3. When you multiply across, you get a 3. The secant of pi over 6 is 2 root 3 over 3. The tangent of pi over 6 is root 3 over 3. Cotangent of pi over 6 would be the reciprocal of that, 1 over root 3 over 3, or you could just write 3 over root 3, and you'll need to rationalize that. So multiply top and bottom by root 3. On top, you'll get 3 root 3. On bottom, you'll get a 3. So this simplifies to root 3. At angle pi over 3, the sine of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. So the cosecant of pi over 3 is the reciprocal of that, or 2 over root 3. We saw this earlier with secant of pi over 6. When we rationalize it, we'll get 2 root 3 over 3. The cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. So the secant of pi over 3 is the reciprocal of that, which is 2. The tangent of pi over 3 is root 3. The cotangent of pi over 3 is the reciprocal of that, or 1 over root 3. I'm going to rationalize that. So multiply top and bottom by root 3. 1 times root 3 on the top is root 3, and root 3 times root 3 on the bottom is just 3. Looking at angle 0, the ordered pair at 0 radians is 1, 0 on the unit circle. This 1 corresponds to the cosine of 0 degrees, and this 0 corresponds to the sine of 0 is 0. So now when we look at the values for our new reciprocal functions, the cosecant of 0 would be 1 over the sine of 0. So I'm going to put 1 over the sine of 0. And sine of 0 was 0, so that's 1 over 0, which is undefined. Secant of 0 is 1 over cosine 0, and cosine 0 is 1. So that's 1 over 1, which is 1. Cotangent 0 is the reciprocal of tangent. So that would be cosine of 0 over sine of 0. Cosine of 0 was 1, and sine of 0 was 0. So this is undefined. This is angle pi over 2. The ordered pair for the point here is 0, 1. The cosine of pi over 2 is 0, and the sine of pi over 2 is 1. So when I go to find the cosecant of pi over 2, that's 1 over the sine of pi over 2, which is 1. So cosecant of pi over 2 is 1. Secant of pi over 2 is 1 over cosine of pi over 2, which is 0. So this is undefined. The cotangent of pi over 2 is cosine over sine. The cosine is 0 and the sine is 1, so that is 0.